The Hall of Binding Truths was never meant for comfort. Its walls curved upward into a dome of polished alloy and calcified memory fibers, a space where the 9 founding species of the Galactic Tribunal met to pass judgment on civilizations that had strayed too far from the compact. Today, that judgment hung over a single delegation seated in the accused circle, a shallow depression at the very center of the vast amphitheater. Chief Prosecutor Orathi occupied the elevated arch platform, his 10 segmented limbs draping across the interface console like the roots of an ancient, pallid tree. His eyes, 5 of them, each a mirror-black lens, fixed on the 3 humans below. They wore simple uniforms, deep blue with silver insignia that seemed almost too understated for the gravity of the moment. None of them spoke. None had spoken since the session began. "You have been summoned," Orathi intoned, his voice translated into 1,000 whispered harmonics that reached every corner of the chamber, "to explain the unprovoked assault your species launched against the Krix ascendancy. Earth's retaliation was indiscriminate. It violated 14 subsections of the compact. This tribunal demands an accounting." Murmurs rippled through the concentric rings of delegates. The Krix ambassador sat in a position of honor to Orathi's left, his iridescent hide rippling with barely concealed satisfaction. Around him, representatives from the Thulian Collective, the Vash Alliance, and 6 other polities watched with mixtures of disdain, curiosity, and the slow-burning tension of species who had never truly understood the newcomers from Sol. The lead human delegate, her name, according to the manifest, was Captain Mara Vance, remained motionless. Her hands rested on her thighs, palms up. Her face was a mask of controlled neutrality, the kind that came from years of swallowing anger and giving it shape only when the moment demanded. Orathi allowed the silence to stretch. "Step forward, human, and explain your species' aggression." Captain Vance rose. The motion was fluid, economical, but there was something in the way she unfolded her frame that sent a ripple of unease through the assembly. She did not walk as a defendant. She walked as if the chamber belonged to her, as if every step were a line drawn in sand that the tide could not erase. Her boots struck the polished floor with a steady rhythm that echoed in the sudden stillness. She crossed the distance to the central platform, a circular dais that glowed faintly under the weight of institutional authority. The translator drones hovering overhead adjusted their fields to capture her every breath. She lifted her chin and looked directly at Orathi. Her eyes, a dark, warm brown, held no fear, no defiance, just an ocean-deep patience that made the prosecutor's limbs twitch involuntarily. "I'm here," she said. Her voice was low, unhurried, yet it carried with the clarity of a bell struck once in a cathedral. "But before I explain anything, I want to show you something." Orathi's crest flickered with irritation. This tribunal does not accept unscheduled evidence without prior review. "You asked for an explanation," Vance replied. "This is part of it." The chamber's ambient lighting dimmed as she touched a control on her wrist. A holographic recording bloomed in the air above the dais, not a formal military log, but raw, unedited footage. The visual began with the blue curve of Earth seen from orbit, peaceful and whole. Then fire. Kinetic strikes spreading across continents. Cities crumbling into ash. A close-up of a shattered street where a child's drawing of a tree fluttered under a gray sky, its crayon colors already fading in the heat. The delegates fell silent, not from reverence, from the sudden, visceral reality of what had been done. The Krix ambassador leaned forward, his translator projecting a tone of diplomatic regret. "Regrettable, but necessary. The biological contamination your species represented." Vance held up a hand and the recording froze on the drawing. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked, "Necessary?" The word hung in the air like a blade. A thin, mirthless smile touched her lips. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop a full degree, and every delegate, even those without thermal sense, felt it in their bones. Part 2, the silent evidence. Captain Vance let the silence do its work. The council members shifted, adjusting their sensory organs, recalibrating their translators, buying time before they had to process what they'd seen. She didn't push. She stood at the center of the platform, feet planted, as the holographic child's drawing continued to drift in the dead air. "You call it necessary," she said, breaking the stillness. Her voice had lost its earlier softness and taken on the texture of worn granite. The Crick's Ascendancy deployed 37 orbital bombardment platforms. They targeted civilian centers, agricultural zones, and medical facilities, all because your assessment flagged us as a latent psionic threat. The Crick's ambassador's hide shimmered with an oily sheen of indignation. Humanity carries dormant psionic potential. Left unchecked, you would have destabilized the entire network. The Compact authorizes preemptive action when a species poses an existential risk to the galactic order. You were given no formal status, no protection. You were a silent threat. Vance tilted her head, as if examining a curious specimen. A silent threat. You dropped kinetic rods on a planet that had never fired a shot at you because you were afraid of what we might become. "We were eliminating a hazard," the ambassador said, his tone hardening. "And yet here you stand, proving our fears entirely justified. Your retaliation destroyed 3 Crick's orbital stations and rendered the Havengate shipyards inoperable. That is an act of war, and you will answer for it." The gallery rumbled with agreement from some quarters, wary silence from others. The Thulian delegate, a tall creature with a crown of sensitive filaments, leaned toward her Vash counterpart and whispered something that didn't translate. The air grew heavy. Vance took a slow breath. She raised her left hand and pressed a sequence on her wrist console. A second recording materialized, but this one was different, not footage of destruction, but a wireframe diagram. It showed a complex molecular structure, twisting like a double helix infused with something strange, something that seemed to pulse even in the static rendering. "This is the human adaptive genome segment designated H37 alpha," she said. "You know it better as the psionic null factor, what your assault force was really after." The Crick's ambassador's coloration shifted from shimmering bronze to a dull, angry copper. "That is classified information." "It's biological reality," Vance countered. She tapped the display and the helix expanded, revealing layered protein structures that interfaced with unknown energy patterns. "Every human carries this. It's what makes us immune to psionic intrusion. Your telepaths can't read us. Your empaths can't influence us. And the more you tried to probe our minds during first contact, the more terrified you became. Because you realized we didn't even know we were blocking you. It was automatic, innate." She lowered her wrist and let the diagram fade. "You didn't attack Earth to eliminate a threat. You attacked to harvest us. Your long-range scouts confirmed that our biology held the key to neutralizing psionic abilities across the entire spectrum. If you could isolate it, weaponize it, you'd hold absolute power over every telepathic species in the galaxy." The silence that followed was not the respectful pause of diplomacy. It was the brittle stillness before a dam breaks. The Orathi prosecutor's limbs tightened around the console. "These are severe accusations. If you have evidence that the Crick's Ascendancy violated the biological integrity protocols, you must present it immediately." Vance looked at him and something shifted behind her eyes. "I'm not presenting evidence," she said. "I'm providing context." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, a subtle vibration passed through the air, a frequency just below audible range but felt. Several psionic delegates recoiled. One of the Thulian aides collapsed, clutching her filament crown as if struck by an electric current. The Crick's ambassador's head snapped back, his jaw plates grinding. Captain Mara Vance had triggered a biochemical pulse from her own body, a controlled release of the same adaptive factor that made humanity invisible to telepathy, but amplified, focused. The chamber's ambient psionic dampening field, designed to prevent mental combat during proceedings, shorted out with a sound like tearing silk. Telepathic species across the gallery screamed or went rigid. Non-psionic species stared in horror. Vance's voice cut through the chaos. We didn't just survive the attack. We learned. We adapted further. And now we're here to ask a different question entirely. Part 3. What they didn't know. The pulse did not stop. It thrummed outward from Vance's body in steady waves, each one layering onto the last. The two other human delegates, a stocky man with close-cropped gray hair and a tall woman with a burned scar across her neck, rose from their seats and stepped forward, adding their own biological fields to the disruption. Together, they formed a triangle of nullification that blanketed the entire chamber. Psionic delegates clawed at their heads or slumped against their restraints. The Kryx ambassador's hide had turned a pale, sickly gray, and his limbs twitched in uncoordinated spasms. Only the non-telepathic species, the armored Grakhull, the gas breathers of the Yell Confederation, and a handful of others, remained fully functional, watching with something between fascination and dread. Orathi, whose telepathic abilities were modest but deeply integrated into his judicial functions, forced himself upright through sheer will. "You are committing an act of aggression within the tribunal's heart," he grated. "This will not go unanswered." Aggression. Vance's voice was calm, the calm of a surgeon explaining a procedure. "This isn't an attack, it's a demonstration. Your psionic network has run this galaxy for millennia. You use it to communicate, to navigate, to enforce treaties. It's the backbone of your civilization, and we can shut it down with a thought." The Kryx ambassador managed to choke out a laugh. "You'll destroy yourselves. The Compact will never tolerate." "The Compact doesn't know what we are," Vance cut in. She gestured, and the holographic display shifted again, this time showing a star chart dotted with thousands of tiny golden points, scattered across the Orion Arm and beyond. "We've been watching you for centuries. Our first deep space telescopes picked up your transmissions in the late 21st century. We saw your wars, your treaties, your patterns of conquest. We realized that your entire society is built on psionic dominance. And we knew that if we revealed ourselves too soon, we'd be enslaved or exterminated." She walked to the edge of the dais, her boots tapping with that same unhurried rhythm. "So we hid. We developed stealth technology that masks our biological emissions. We built colonies on rogue planets and in the voids between stars. We planted sleeper agents in your trade networks, your academic institutions, even your military academies, humans who could pass as other species with the right surgical modifications. And we waited." The chamber had gone very still. Even the psionic delegates who weren't paralyzed had stopped struggling, too horrified by the implications to move. "When the Kryx attacked Earth," Vance continued, "they thought they were hitting a single, isolated world. They had no idea that Earth is just the visible tip of a civilization that spans 100 light years. They didn't know that the moment their first kinetic rod fell, a signal went out, a signal that activated every sleeper, every hidden cache, every contingency we'd prepared for this exact scenario." She looked directly at the Kryx ambassador, whose eyes had gone wide and glassy. "Protocol reckoning. You didn't attack a primitive planet. You kicked a sleeping titan, and it's very much awake." Part 4. The real indictment. The pulse intensified, not painfully but with an inexorable pressure that made the psionic delegates feel as though their minds were being gently, firmly pressed into a box. Their telepathy was gone. Their empathy was muffled. For the first time in their lives, many of them were utterly alone inside their own skulls, and the isolation was terrifying. Captain Vance let the sensation linger before she spoke again. 2 hours ago, synchronized teams aboard every Kryx military installation received a biological override trigger. The humans you abducted for experimentation, the ones you kept in stasis tubes and vivisection labs, woke up. Their dormant null fields activated. In the span of 17 minutes, they disabled your entire defensive grid from the inside. The Kryx ambassador's color shifted to a sickly yellow. "You're lying." "Check your communications," Vance said. "Oh, wait. You can't. Your psionic relays are down. Your fleet is drifting without navigation. Your ground forces can't coordinate because their telepathic officers are curled up on the floor, experiencing what we call the deep quiet." She turned to face the rest of the council, her expression no longer neutral but deeply, fiercely earnest. You summoned us here to explain an attack on Earth, but you never asked why our population tripled in a century while staying hidden from your sensors. You never asked how we built starships without leaving industrial footprints you could detect. You never asked the real question. Oratha's limbs, still trembling, managed to shape a query. And what question is that? Vance's smile returned, but this time it wasn't terrible. It was almost sad. The question is, what kind of species prepares to fake its own extinction for 10,000 years? What kind of species builds backup caches of genetic material on 1,000 asteroids, writes its entire cultural memory into crystalline matrices, and teaches its children from birth that the universe is hostile and that survival means patience, not power? She let the question settle. The Grakul delegate, whose species had no psionic abilities and thus remained unaffected, spoke for the first time, a deep, grinding voice like tectonic plates shifting. A species that never planned to lose. Correct, Vance said. We didn't plan to win either. We planned to endure. Every single human alive knows the contingency. If Earth falls, if all our colonies are discovered, if we're pushed to the brink of extinction, the survivors will scatter. They'll wait 1,000 years, 2,000, 10,000, however long it takes, and they will return with all the knowledge of what destroyed us, and they will be absolutely unforgiving. She walked to the frozen Krix ambassador and stood directly in front of him. His wide, terrified eyes tracked her movement, but he couldn't even twitch. She lifted her wrist console and showed him a live feed. Krix orbital platforms powering down, their crews emerging with hands raised, human figures in simple tactical gear moving through the corridors. You asked for an explanation, she said, not just to him but to the entire chamber. Here it is. We are not the species you should fear. We are the species that will end the fear itself by making it obsolete. Part 5. The Frozen Council. The chamber was a tableau of paralysis. Delegates from psionic species sat rigid, their bodies locked by a field that bypassed their nervous systems and spoke directly to the ancient, primitive fear centers of their brains. The Krix ambassador's mouth opened and closed silently, his jaw plates clicking against each other. Oratha, the mighty prosecutor, could only move his eyes. Captain Vance walked through the stillness as if it were a garden of statues. The two other humans maintained the null field, their expressions focused but calm. This was not rage. This was not revenge. This was a calculated surgical procedure performed on an entire political body. I want you to listen, Vance said, her voice carrying the weight of a species that had held its breath for generations. Because what happens next depends entirely on what you decide in the next few minutes. I'm going to release the field partially. Non-psionic delegates will regain full motor function. Psionic delegates will be able to speak and vote, but not to use their abilities. Any attempt to engage psionic communication or combat will result in immediate and total neural severance. She nodded to the gray-haired man, who adjusted a device on his belt. The oppressive pressure in the air lessened, and several delegates gasped as control returned to their limbs. The psionic species remained restricted, but they could now turn their heads, swallow, and, crucially, speak. Oratha's voice was hoarse when he found it. You have made your point, Captain. You have demonstrated terrifying power. What do you want? Vance returned to the central dais. I want the truth on record. I want every delegate to vote on 3 resolutions. First, the Krix Ascendancy's attack on Earth is formally condemned as a violation of the Biological Integrity Protocols and the Preemptive Aggression Statutes. Second, all psionic weapon programs across all member species will be dismantled within 1 standard cycle, with human inspectors granted full access. Third, interstellar travel and communication will be subject to human oversight for a period of no less than 50 years, to ensure no hidden weapons or fleet movements threaten Earth or its colonies again. The chamber erupted in protests, but Vance raised a hand and the null field tightened just enough to remind them of their predicament. The protests died. These aren't demands from a conqueror, she said. These are the minimum requirements for us to trust you. We could have burned your fleets. We could have collapsed your network and watched your civilizations tear each other apart in the dark. We chose not to. That choice has value. Recognize it." The Crick's ambassador, still partially frozen, managed to force words through clenched jaw plates. "You're insane. The Compact will never accept human hegemony." Vance turned to him, and there was something in her face now. Not anger, not triumph, but the deep, bone-weary patience of someone who had carried a burden for far too long. "You keep using words like hegemony and dominance because that's how you think. You can't imagine power without oppression. You can't imagine strength without cruelty. That's why you lost before this trial even began." She reached into the pocket of her uniform and withdrew a small object, a smooth, dark stone, worn by millennia of wind and water until it fit perfectly in her palm. She set it on the podium with a soft click that echoed through the silent chamber. "This is a piece of Earth's core rock," she said, 4 billion years old. It survived volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, ice ages, and the death of species. It was there when the first self-replicating molecule formed. It will be there long after every one of us in this room is dust. You tried to destroy the planet that made this stone. Take a good look." The delegates stared at the unassuming gray rock, and for the first time they understood. Part 6. The Terms of Survival. The vote took less than an hour. The Grakul delegate was the first to signal assent, his tectonic voice rumbling through the chamber with an unexpected note of admiration. The Yell Confederation followed, their gas-filled membranes pulsing with a kind of somber relief. One by one, the non-psionic species threw their support behind humanity's resolutions, not out of fear alone, but because Vance had shown them something they had never truly believed possible, a powerful species that chose restraint. The psionic delegates, still under partial restriction, were more reluctant. The Thulian collective attempted to argue that the terms violated their sovereignty. The Vash Alliance threatened economic sanctions that rang hollow in the face of their current helplessness. But when the final tally appeared on the central display, the resolutions passed by a margin that surprised even Vance. The Crick's ascendancy, stripped of its military capacity and abandoned by its former allies, was officially censured. The ambassador's protests were recorded and ignored. Orathi, who had regained full control of his limbs and was visibly struggling to process what had occurred, approached Vance after the session concluded. The chamber was emptying, delegates filing out under the watchful eyes of human operatives who had materialized from seemingly nowhere. The prosecutor's many limbs moved with a tentative, almost respectful hesitation. "Captain," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance, "was there ever a moment when you truly feared extinction, or was this outcome always inevitable?" Vance picked up the stone from the podium and turned it over in her fingers. "We feared it every day. That's what kept us sharp. We prepared for extinction with the same dedication you prepare for expansion. We buried caches on rogue asteroids in the atmospheres of gas giants in the frozen crusts of orphan moons. Genetic material, historical records, art, music, poetry, mathematics, everything that makes us who we are. Even if every living human died tomorrow, our species would return in a few thousand years, with all the knowledge of what destroyed us and none of the mercy you've seen today." She held out the stone to him. "Take it, a gift so you remember, we are not your enemies unless you make us so." Oratha's primary limb extended, and he accepted the stone with a care that bordered on ceremonial. The ancient rock, unremarkable in every physical sense, seemed to weigh far more than its mass should allow. He closed his digits around it and inclined his head. "I will remember," he said. Vance nodded and walked away, her boots echoing in the empty hall. Part 7. The Long Peace. The human ship Persistent hung in the silent black beyond the tribunal's orbital station, its hull scarred but intact. Inside the crew lounge, Captain Mara Vance sat with her 2 companions, Sergeant Rin Kellen, the gray-haired man who had served as her tactical officer for 17 years, and Lieutenant Priya Okonkwo, the burn-scarred woman whose expertise in biological warfare had made the null-field technology possible. They were exhausted, their uniforms rumpled, their faces drawn with the particular fatigue that follows a battle won not with fire but with nerve. Kellen poured himself a bulb of coffee substitute and settled into a crash couch. They'll test us, you know. Give it a decade, maybe two, and someone will try to rebuild a psionic weapon program in secret. They always do. Let them try, Okonkwo said, her voice rasping from an old injury. We'll catch them. We've got inspectors on every major station now, and the sleeper network is still in place. We'll know before they do. Vance stared out the viewport at the distant swirl of the galactic core. This isn't about catching them. It's about making them not want to. That's the difference between winning a war and ending one. Activated her log recorder, the soft chime breaking the quiet. Captain's log supplemental. The tribunal has voted to accept human oversight. Earth is secure for now. Our colonies remain hidden. The Krix Ascendancy's military capability has been neutralized, and reparations negotiations will begin next cycle. But the real victory isn't political. It's psychological. For the first time, the galaxy knows our name, not as a threat but as a promise. We didn't win a war today. We ended the possibility of one. She paused, her reflection ghosting over the stars. There's a stone sitting on the central pedestal of the tribunal chamber right now. 4 billion years of Earth's history, polished by time. Every delegate who walks past it will remember that humanity didn't rise up in anger. We rose up in patience, and that's so much more terrifying. Epilogue 3 years later. The new Orathi ambassador, a younger, smaller-limbed member of the species who had studied human history at a joint cultural exchange institute, approached the Terran embassy on the neutral station crossing point. She carried with her a formal request from the Reformed Tribunal. They wished to learn what humans called the art of patient defiance. The human ambassador, a woman whose face bore the weathered calm of someone who had lived through the Krix attack as a child, smiled and gestured to a display case in the embassy's entrance. Inside, on a cushion of dark velvet, rested a smooth gray stone. It begins with a stone, she said, and a story come inside.